For my Christmas story this year, I want to take you back to 1963, half a century ago, over half a century ago. I was about 15 at the time, and if you will remember, those of you who are older, if you will remember, 1963 was a very cold year, and in South Wales we had some heavy snow, which was quite unusual because the Gulf Stream flows past South Wales, and normally we get very little snow. Anyway, that year we had a lot of snow, and we romped in the woodlands. Our home was surrounded by woodlands, and there was a mountain right behind the wood, snow-capped mountain, in the winter of 1963. We went up into the woods and were entranced by the changes, not just to how things looked, but the whole atmosphere. Everything became so quiet because, of course, the snow dampened all the sounds. It felt very quiet and very special, quite mystical really, although I don't suppose I would have used such a word back then. And we went tobogganing, and we went looking at the streams and seeing the icicles, and we saw the way in which snowdrifts altered the shape of the landscape. And we had a lovely winter, but also a very cold winter. What we didn't know in 1963, and what I didn't know until many years later, was that underneath that woodland, that snow-covered woodland, was a past, a history, which would take us back to 1875, exactly 150 years ago today, or at least a couple of days ago. 5th of December 1875, and another snow-filled landscape, the same landscape, the Garth Woods as it was called, but a very different scene for those who were there at that time, because instead of a sort of paradisical world of nature, mountains and trees, there was a mine, there was a coal mine, drift mine. And in the mountain, in the Garth Mountain, were countless tunnels, and miners in their hundreds were tunneling away through that winter for coal in very, very grim circumstances. On the 5th of December 1875, it had snowed, and the mine was somewhat more risky during times of extreme cold. So the overman of the mine, before the shift came on duty on that morning, had to check the tunnels to see whether there was any fire damp. Fire damp is a rather strange word, which actually means gas. Gas that, if lit, would explode and cause an enormous fire and enormous catastrophe. So it was routine for the overman and the firemen to do their rounds before the shift came on duty, early on that morning of December the 5th, 1875. Just about 200 yards from where my home was, 100 years later, 130 years later. Anyway, they checked the tunnels, and there is a controversy about whether they found anything or not. Suffice to say that when they came back, the overman directed everyone to start their duty, and so they poured into the mines to do their work for that day. That's our little dog, who will have some opinion on this story. He's a very noisy dog. Anyway, I shall carry on. What happened soon after the shift began is now the subject of mining history. There was an explosion. There was a firestorm. What happened was that the first flash of flame when the gas was lit caused a great commotion of dust, of coal dust, through the tunnels, and that coal dust actually caught fire and created a firestorm, a sort of wall of flame, literally a wall of flame that sped through the tunnels within moments, within seconds of that terrible event. Surprisingly and thankfully, only 16 people were killed on that day. So it wasn't a major tragedy in Welsh mining history. Some 30 years later, in the Senghenydd tragedy in 1911, over 400 miners were killed. The largest mining disaster in UK history, I think. Industrial disaster in UK history. Over 400 people died that day. There were hundreds of miners down in the mine under the Garth Mountain on December the 5th, 1875. But fortunately, the mines didn't completely collapse, so many of them were able to escape. However, 16 miners didn't escape and were burnt alive, killed, or injured under the falling props, pit props in the rock. It was a terrible event. But in 1963, when I was romping through the woods with my friends and family, I had no knowledge of that day in December of 1875, because the village had decided to forget. I had no awareness of anything that had happened until many years later, because there were great controversies about who was at fault, and because in the inquest the miners were more or less blamed, or at least the overman was blamed for not telling the miners, not warning the miners. Nobody questioned the mine owner. The mine owner was not asked to testify to whether the mine was safe, whether the safety features were sufficient for that time. Of course, safety was a very different matter in those days. But the inquest laid the blame on the overman Abraham Phillips, who became the sort of scapegoat for that tragedy. And in the years following that tragedy, the village, I think it's not proven, but the village decided to forget because it couldn't handle the guilt by association. That the miners were the problem. The miners had worked when they shouldn't have worked. Of course, the mine owners wanted them to work, not least because in those days the prices, the European price of coal was very unstable, and so the pressure to work, the pressure to keep the mine going in all conditions was very intense. So when Christmas came to the village of Gwaelod, where I grew up, when Christmas came in 1875, a few days after the tragedy, 16 dead bodies lay, probably still unburied because there were delays in terms of the inquest and inspecting the medical evidence. So on Christmas Day 1875, there was a very different world, a world of death and destruction and sadness and tragedy. But in 1963, when I was romping through the woods, I had no idea of what happened literally beneath my feet. The entrance to the mine was 200 yards away from where I grew up. The mine tunnels and the vein, it was called Brass Vein, the mine tunnel that was the site of the explosion, was probably more or less underneath my home, beneath the rocks of the Garth Mountain where our house was situated. And coming back to the present, December 2025, just a couple of days ago, is the 150th anniversary of that terrible event. I forgot to tell you that the 16 miners included one child, age of 12, actually employed in the mine to keep the the doors to keep the door open and closed so that the air could circulate. They employed a 12-year-old boy and he died too. And now, in 2025, there is a memorial to that tragedy in Gwaelod, just a few yards from my home. And indeed, 2 days ago, when the anniversary took place, there was a ceremony and local school children gave readings, and there was some songs and some reflections from local people, and even the BBC came along, I believe, and recorded it for the BBC News. Christmas, a time of great joy, a time in our childhood where we have a very special joy, and as I said right at the beginning, Christmas was a time when the snow came, when it was all special and different and almost mystical. And yet beneath our feet was history and tragedy. But finally there is something of a happy ending, because that ceremony did take place 2 or 3 days ago. Finally the village remembered. It took a long time. It was one woman, Norma Proctor, about 10-15 years ago, began to campaign for a memorial, and as a result of her work, people in the village now remember that tragedy, and remember the names, and remember the people. Many of the families are still families that are connected with the village. So that is my Christmas story, a kind of mixed story, a lot of sadness and tragedy, and a certain amount, quite a lot of injustice if you pick through the details of that story. But finally, people have remembered, and people have honoured the dead, and people have decided to think through all those things that happened many years ago. Christmas is a time of joy, of innocence, of hope, of new birth, but it also must include not forgetting the past. And for me, that means not forgetting my past and what lay beneath my feet as I ran here and there on the snow-capped paths of Garthwood in 1963. So can I wish you all a happy Christmas.